So if I didn't understand a little something about this gospel passage, I'd certainly be embarrassed proclaiming it in our culture today. We talk about adultery, talk about divorce, obviously. All right, there are people who have been divorced. There's people who commit adultery. Of course, it's all sin. But what this gospel gets at really is, and everyone should see this as a tough gospel. It should be something that's said as a tough gospel, seen as a tough gospel. It is. It's supposed to be tough. And there's this understanding about the ideal, right? There's the ideal, then there's a practical. And whenever you set a goal, you want to set an ideal goal because you know we're probably going to fall a little bit short of the ideal. And what ends up happening is a lot of times we tend to set the goals then to what we think is achievable, and we don't shoot for the ideal. Remember, this is a whole discussion on Plan B, purgatory, heaven, purgatory. You know? So this is all coming up in the same passage. It's all chapter 5 through 7. Jesus starts out this little thing about honor, least in grace, greatest in the kingdom of heaven. All right, and he kind of attracts them with that, and he starts hitting it with all this stuff that they're like, hey, this is really tough to live up to. And so we have this understanding here that we start to lower the ideal goal to the practical. Then what happens to the practical is then we get lazy, and then we lower it more, and then we lower it more. Okay, and it really gets bad. So if you haven't experienced that, we kind of have a tendency to do that. Of course, we don't want to do that in our prayer lives. We certainly don't want to do that in the practice of our religion. So this gospel passage really gets at the 9th commandment, which is about thoughts. It's at the thoughts and the attitudes towards sin. And this is what Jesus is getting at. We start to put all this stuff out there. It gets at how we look at sin, how we look at certain behaviors, how we look at certain topics or subjects, how we look at adultery or murder or anger, okay, how we look at those things. And that's where the big sin begins. You know, I always say adultery doesn't happen overnight, okay? It's a long time coming, all right? Things like that don't happen overnight. Divorce doesn't happen overnight. It's a long time coming, all right? So we look at this. Let's put it in the proper context. It's Matthew 5:17 through 37. It's after, what has Jesus just done? He redefines honorable behavior in the Beatitudes, then calling all of his followers to holiness and mission. That was salt and light. He's calling them all to holiness and mission through the analogy of the salt and light. Then he announces his sermon's theme. This is the main theme of the Sermon on the Mount, the righteousness of his followers. Starts right out with that. Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And so the Pharisees and scribes, they were looked upon as they were holy. And they really weren't, but okay, that's beside the point. They were looked upon as they were the goal to become, right? They're rulers of Israel, etc. They own the law, etc., and they're supposed to be living up to it. All right, and so we know what their issue is, but we're not going to get into that. So the idea here is that he knows, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. That's a huge, strong, bold claim that Jesus makes right off the bat. You have to be better than the Pharisees and scribes. From our perspective, yeah, because we know they're not really that great, so we're like, okay, we can do that. All right, we're kind of excited about becoming better than the Pharisees and scribes. For them, this is huge. So righteousness means proper and honorable relationships with other people and with God. We're talking about our relationships with one another. We're talking about living in the family of God here, particularly among the followers of Jesus, that is, Christians. Like how Christians relate to one another, how Christians, of course, relate to God. And so he speaks of a new kind of law. And this is the whole theme, this is the underlying theme. We don't want to get hung up on what he says because what he's saying really is that it's possible now because of Jesus Christ and the law, the new law of grace, the new law of freedom, the new law of love, to live up to the ideal. This is the great good news that we have. We get hit with all this stuff, and it's like, well, wait a minute. The thing here is that we can achieve holiness. We can be better than we are. And so he speaks of this new kind of law that enables us to do this. It's a law of love, it's a law of grace, a law of freedom, while not abolishing the old law and the prophets, but rather fulfilling them. And so this new law is this love of God and neighbor. Loving God and neighbor fulfills the old law of the 10 Commandments. So again, all the 10 Commandments are summarized in love God and love neighbor. Paragraph 1972, the Catechism of the Catholic Church is a good reminder to us that the new law of love causes our actions to flow from the love infused by the Holy Spirit rather than from fear of punishment from committing violations of the law, right? We're always afraid. We're supposed to be afraid to commit sin. And so here, though, and of course, you raise children. You can rule them by terror or fear, or you can rule them by love. Both are effective, but you'd rather have them ruled by love, right? And so then there's a difference in reaction. So the new law is a law of grace because it confers the strength of grace to act by means of faith and the sacraments. That's why the practice of religion is so important. Access to the sacraments, sacramental grace, sanctifying grace, communication life of God, so that we can act in charity, we can act in love. And so it's the law of freedom because it sets us free from the ritual and juridical observances of the old law and inclines us to act spontaneously by the promptings of charity. Again, so we have all these laws and rules in the church. We don't want to fall into a legalism of the practice of our religion. I did this. I went to Mass today. Check. All right. I didn't flip that person off the parking lot today. Check. Okay. So it's not about checks and pluses and minuses. Okay. It's about allowing us to be prompted by love, allowing us to act in love. And so this is what actually is being fulfilled. But the rules, they guide us in the right direction. That's why there's like traffic signals and signs as you drive. Can you imagine if there were not traffic lights at intersections? Yeah, big problem, all right? Okay, so similarly, we have this law and these rules that guide us to this, to learning how to learning how to live in love. And so grace, of course, completes it for us. Inclines us to act spontaneously by the promptings of charity. And so Jesus, he's removing the juridical declaration of righteousness. Remember, old law is you did this, you avoided this, good job. You are declared righteous. That's it. It's a declaration. That's not how we're supposed to live under Jesus Christ. We're supposed to be living in relationships that are actually fulfilling and satisfying. And only through love and the law of grace, law of freedom, can we do that. It's by grace that we do that. Because of Jesus Christ, we're able to meet these high ideal standards. And so he's replacing this juridical declaration of righteousness by law, replacing it with being made righteous by the way we act in our relationships with one another and with God. How are we made righteous, or how are we righteous? How do we know we're righteous or not? Declaration of right. It's not declaration. It's the way we act towards one another. It's the way we act towards God. How do we behave towards God? How do we behave towards one another? And then, of course, now he starts to push, even at the level of your thoughts. And this is where it starts to get tough. So we love, though, by an interior change of heart. There has to be an interior change of heart, not by rules. We don't love by rules. You can set up as many rules as you want. It's not going to get the person to love. You can get your children to behave a certain way by setting up rules. But you hope they learn someday there's an interior change of heart, and they start to realize, hey, you know what, Mom and Dad were right. Might not come till they're 40 years old, but, they might say, after a long time, there was a purpose in that, even though we detested all those rules growing up, right? There's a reason for this stuff. But we love by freedom that causes us to act spontaneously in an ease of charity. And so the interior dispositions of our hearts and our attitudes towards certain actions that we allow into our hearts is what causes very serious sin. So again, it's the interior dispositions of our hearts and our attitudes towards actions that causes very serious sin. Okay, besides the woundedness, we're not getting into that today, but how we look at these things is already an indication that we're going to slip into the sin if we're not careful. All right? Jesus addresses these serious sins one by one. He says, if you want to stop killing, he says, stop allowing yourselves to be angry and resentful, because murder begins with anger and resentment and harboring vengeful thoughts. Raka means insolent. It means as an insolent contempt, meaning empty-headed, Of course, fool. When we call somebody a fool, there's a fixed and settled hatred. So he goes into that, raka, fool. Of course, Gehenna is a big garbage dump that is just on fire all the time nearby in the Hinnom, Valley of Hinnom, which is a reference to hell. Okay, so he says, if you're going to stop killing, watch your anger. All right? Don't feed it. If you wish to avoid taking oaths or vows or swear that your word is true, then simply be honest in all things so that your yes and no may be credible to you as true or reliable. Be a person of your word. This always happened mostly in trading and marketplaces. I swear, it's a good price, I swear. I swear on my head. I swear on my life. I swear on my, you don't just say yes. No. Just be honest. You see, so this happened often. They would swear by a lot of different things. They would swear by the golden temple, not the temple, but the golden temple, and they do all this little playing with how much they could swear by without swearing on God himself. But it's still a play, all right? They're not being honest. So the point here is thoughts lead to beliefs. Beliefs lead to actions. This is why we control our thoughts. That's why this is under the 9th commandment, to control your thoughts. 9th commandment commands purity in thought. How are my thoughts? See, everybody has a reason to go to confession. Okay? So any thoughts that any lustful fantasies, murderous, revengeful fantasies we indulge in more than 3 seconds, it's in our mind. Sin. Okay? We have to shut those things off. So we have plenty of reason to go to confession. So thoughts lead to beliefs, beliefs lead to actions. So we have to control our thoughts. Because if we're going to avoid the action, we have to make sure we're guarding over our thoughts. Okay, just like murder begins with anger, all right? We want to make sure that we take care of our thoughts so it doesn't lead to the action, all right? So if you want to stop committing adultery, then stop the lustful thoughts and fantasies that we allow into our hearts and minds. Yeah, that's it. Guard your thoughts. Guard your thoughts. Anyone ever see Caddyshack? Yeah. There's a scene in there that I shouldn't get into this, but the manager of the golf course, he goes up to Bill Murray, he says, guard your eyes, man. He's Scottish. Guard your eyes, man. He says, guard your eyes. Because Bill Murray's like lusting after one of these golfers on a golf course, you know. You guys remember that scene? You don't remember. You're all going to go home and Google and look for the scene now. Okay, but even then, you get advice from Caddyshack golf course manager. Guard your eyes. Guard your eyes. What do we allow into our vision? What do we feed our thoughts all the time? It's not easy, you know, because we live in such an immodest, over-sexualized culture. But we have to be careful about our thoughts. That leads to adultery. Where does adultery begin? Okay? In a thought. So if you wish to stop divorce, then uphold the permanence of marriage. Uphold the permanence of marriage. The old law, see, here's the thing. Divorce is okay, it happens. That attitude is enough to put you on the path. You know, and our culture, of course, teaches that. All right, and again, this is not a condemnation of those who've been divorced. Relationships are tough, okay? Relationships with God are tough. Relationships with one another even tougher. Heck, relationships with parents are tough. Relationships with one another are tough. They're tough. It's difficult to be acting in charity with one another all the time. Okay, that's why Jesus actually promoted first. Forgiveness. We are people who reconcile with one another. We're all family here. All right? We hurt each other from time to time, and then we have to reconcile. We ask for forgiveness. And so, it's not a condemnation. Again, Jesus isn't condemning. He's raising the bar. He's reminding them of what is already there. This goes back to the Old Testament, the permanence of marriage. The old law recognized that God's plan for marriage is a permanent monogamous relationship. He's upholding that in the gospel today. Why? Well, because you know as well as I do that divorce is disruptive to a tight-knit community called a family. And so Jesus is saying avoid it for the sake of family unity, of course, except for physical abuse. Sometimes, we don't advocate divorce, we advocate separation first. If there's physical abuse, separate. You don't want to be in that situation. Domestic abuse is never acceptable. And so he's saying, remember, two become one, and so that's something that should not be separated. But, there's difficulties. So Matthew's community, however, seemed to permit divorce. It says it in here. If the marriage was unlawful, it says, or of a sexual irregularity. And for instance, according to Leviticus 18, 6 through 18, it's a reference to incestuous unions, to include being married to your sister-in-law while your brother was still living. That would constitute a reason for divorce, which would occur among Gentile converts. You have these Gentiles, and they married their sister-in-laws, while their brother was still alive. And so that was according to Leviticus, that was considered to be incest. So they had to fix that. They allowed divorce under that little phrase, unless the marriage is unlawful. So we don't want to make things up. There's two Hebrew schools here. The Hebrew school of Shammai identified sexual misconduct on the woman's part, and the more progressive school of Hillel allowed divorce for other lesser reasons, such as burning dinner. So it's left to interpretation, but what's really meant there is that, an unlawful marriage is something that is in reference to incest, something that is not, that has something along the bloodlines too close. So whatever the case or interpretation, the point there is that no one should look for reasons to divorce. Because why? Because Jesus is upholding God's original intention for marriage since Genesis. Permanence. The two shall become one, which is why God created male and female in the first place. Why are we not all men? Why are we not all women? Why are we all not androgynous? Well, because God created us in his own image and likeness. So he created us male and female. He created us so that we could be complements of one another and then become one with him. So for the sake of union. A union, you want that to be permanent with God. Okay? So again, this is not a condemnation of people who have been divorced. We don't want to fall into that. We have to be careful what we hear, what are we listening to here in this gospel. And so note that contemporary annulments, brings in the question, right? Contemporary annulments that we have in our church today, they do not conflict with the gospel, but rather are consistent with its teachings, since annulments are investigations into whether or not the marriage was entered into freely and validly. What is it about marriage? For it to be effective or for the sacrament to be valid, you have to enter into it freely, without coercion, without fear, without being drunk, without being pregnant, without being high, all these things. You have to know what you're doing because you're laying your life down for the other. If your judgment is impaired in any way whatsoever, you invalidate your consent. All right, so this is what annulments do. They're investigations to show if consent was defective or not at the time or before the time of the wedding. Okay, adultery after the wedding does not constitute grounds for annulment. Doesn't matter how bad your spouse was. Okay, that's not what gets people annulled. Like it gets decrees of nullity from that day forward. It's because of something else that was there before the wedding. And so that's what the investigation is for. So this is not, they're not promoting, church does not promote divorce in any way. But in addition, unless a person formally petitions the church for the investigation, the marriage is assumed valid by canon law. Marriage enjoys the favor of law, that's what it says. Okay, so unless anyone asks to formally petition the church to investigate their marriage, then it's considered to be valid. Two Catholics or a Catholic and a non-Catholic, they get married in the Catholic Church, then it's considered to be valid. So ultimately, bring it all together. The whole point is that Jesus is calling us to deeper holiness. And St. John Paul II hit this so hard in Theology of the Body, and he talked about that in his Wednesday audiences, and he would say, and he repeated this exact thing: "You've already committed adultery with her in your heart." He called everyone to holiness. There's a Pope reminding us so often about the call to holiness. So important for us. And why? Why is this stuff so important for us? Well, because it works towards our eternal salvation. Because someone has chosen to love you and God, and he wants you to get home to heaven. And yes, there's all these things that we're supposed to live by, but they're good for our nature. So all this, I sum up with, don't use your forehead for a hammer. Why not? Well, try it and find out, okay? Like, no one would ever do that, right? So all these other laws, they become somehow arguable. Oh, well, what's wrong with adultery? What's wrong with a little fornication once in a while? Why are all these commands given to us? For our good. Same reason you give rules to your children. Same reason we have received rules from our parents growing up, because it's moving us towards something. And so the whole point here is that Jesus is calling us to deeper holiness through the conforming of ourselves to God, especially so that the world may recognize God in our actions. What was that? That's mission, to be light, which is accomplished through the ordering of our thoughts and attitudes of our hearts. That's what's really going on here. It's an examination of our thoughts and our attitudes of our hearts towards sin. And of course, Jesus is really serious about it. If your eye causes you sin, pluck it out and throw it away. If your right hand causes you sin, cut it off and throw it away. He doesn't really mean that, right? He means be serious about this. Okay, the sin doesn't happen without any reason whatsoever. It's because we start small, and then it snowballs, and it gets worse. And then it leads to things like murder and adultery. That's what he's telling his listeners. So our sanctity will reveal God to others through our loving relationships with people, which is our mission as Christians. Again, to be salt and light. He's building on that. Holiness, mission. Evangelization, drawing other people to Christ through the way in which they view the way we behave towards one another and towards God, which should be charity and love. And so now, in the midst of our continual struggles, we bring this home practically. In the midst of our continual struggles with our anger, our lust, or our sense of self-importance, we will likely think that this advice Jesus is giving is downright stupid. Who could ever live up to this, right? But herein lays the hidden wisdom of God for the purposes of our glory. Go back to that second reading. There's a mystery in this. There's a wisdom that people just don't understand. You mean there's another way of living besides just giving into your passions, your body? Yes. And that other way actually does lead to happiness and fulfillment and satisfying relationships. The gospel opposes the world. I hope you figured that out by now. The gospel opposes the world, and we will suffer for it. And God does not ask us to go with the flow. We are not asked to go along with the culture. I'll just do what everybody else does. You'll be all right. It's not what God asks of us. He asks a lot more. He asks for holiness. But he does not leave us without the grace to meet that ideal goal. And that's the greatest news of all. So he doesn't set up an impossible standard, an ideal, and go, now good luck. He goes, by the way, I'm going to go die on the cross for you. And I'm going to make grace available to you so that you can be chaste. So you don't need to divorce. You don't need to commit adultery. You don't need to sin anymore. Because my grace is sufficient for you. And so if the marriage relationship is difficult, then the couple is usually called to further conversion, not divorce, a deeper communion with the church and God. It's not easy to live that. Couples will not go along with that idea. They'll divorce. It'll happen. It doesn't mean you're bad. We're all pretty much well aware of our sin, okay? And for whatever, again, relationships are difficult. The church puts elements in place so that it'll have a way to reconcile and then move on forward and remarry in the church. Okay, so again, it's not a condemnation. It's an emphasis about the grace available to us. And we can read this any way we want. I mean, of course, we're aware of our guilt, and that's what confession is for, and it takes care of a lot of things. And so it gets us back on the horse, so to speak, and we're riding along victorious, right? Okay, so deeper communion with the church and God. So with the Holy Spirit, the old law is automatically fulfilled when we are living from an interior charity, a renewed disposition of heart, a purity of heart, and a new attitude toward lesser sins. That's what the push is. A check for our attitudes and our thoughts towards sin. We don't have to resign ourselves to, well, I commit adultery every other month, so it's not every month, but it's every other month, so it's okay. No, that's the wrong attitude, right? Yeah, I only look at pornography once every other week. You know, and no, it's not acceptable. What do you want for yourself? And that's what it comes back to. What do you want for yourself? Do you want this? The Lord talks of the glory of God He speaks of no eye ever imagining, no ear ever hearing, no eye ever seeing, no ear ever hearing of the glory that awaits those who love God. If we love God, we want to be with God. And so we're here to work on how to get to be with God. Holiness is a way to do that. It's not impossible. He sets it up so that we have the grace to be able to live the ideal. And of course, we're going to fall, and then that's what the sacrament of confession is for, to heal again and then start over. God is very forgiving, always, always, always forgiving. So we might think we're not hurting anybody with those smaller sins, but Jesus is saying that we're closer to murder, adultery, divorce, and dishonesty than we think. All right? And we don't want to, and don't fall into judging yourself either. That's a tool, that is a snare of the devil. We have a tendency to judge ourselves. Sometimes, most of the time, we're our worst judge. We don't need someone else to tell us. So don't beat yourselves up about it. Just go to confession and live in the Lord's love. I mean, that's really what he wants us to do. And so we're called to holiness, and so we are to conform ourselves to God even at the level of our thoughts. And that's the challenging part about that. All right, and that's why there's a ninth commandment, and that's why the sacrament of confession is available. And, priests are not usually going to say no, except maybe on Sundays, but to hear their confession. But normally, they're available every time you need them for that. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge to everybody. It's not just you. It's me too. Like I said, how often do you hear me say, I go to confession every 1 to 3 weeks? You have no idea what's going on in my mind. You don't want to know, okay? You have no idea. The conscience is to the person and God alone. All right, and you're the one who has to accuse yourself of your sin, and of course then so that we can experience this beautiful reconciliation with God, and it's a repeated reconciliation, and again, it's about our relationships with God and with one another, so that our love will shine through the way we behave towards one another and towards God, and others will be attracted to that and want to come to the same table of Jesus Christ, the wedding feast of the Lamb.